Recorded. All right. We are looking at the book of Joshua. Um, Growing up, Joshua was my favorite character, I think, because I thought he was so cool in the Ten Commandments movie with Charleston Heston. There was just something about that Joshua character. Um, he was always swinging on I don't know if you remember it, the introduction of the character. I can still see it vividly. He's swinging on the little scaffolding as they're building these structures for the Egyptians. And then for some reason, I always thought he was just like this rocking guy. But as it turns out, he is. And the book that we're looking at could more aptly be called The Exploits of Joshua, because he is the, outside of God being the first character, but really the role that Joshua played, his conquests, that is what the book of Joshua is really about. And so it's aptly named after him. It is, interestingly enough, and I did not know this until I was preparing for this, and where did I write it down? Oh, yeah. So his name was originally Hosea, so Hoshea, or Het in Hebrew, which means salvation, and the Joshua, the J that comes into that actually was changed by Moses, and it means it's the conflation of Yahweh and what the previous name Hoshea was, to form Joshua, meaning Yahweh is salvation. So just even the very sense of his name, this was the final threshold for the Israelites. And as you recall, and we've had a week off, and if you do them sort of in books and chunks, and now we're really at that place where when we sort of group information, we are now on the sixth book of the Bible, and we've looked at 5 of them. And those first 5, again, are called the Pentateuch, pentagon 5. And so the Pentateuch, and it's the story of Israelites' journey from the story of the world, from creation to the establishment of the Israelites with Abraham in Genesis. And then from that point forward, you have, again, if you trace the whole story, Genesis contains that early humanity, Noah, Babel, everyone's screwing up and God's mad at them all. And so, but doesn't destroy them all, brings them to that place where God decides to redeem everyone through a chosen people. And then you see the beginning of that development that goes through Genesis, leading up to the point of, again, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then leading up to that point where Joseph is poised in Egypt. And then the Egyptians the Israelites are all going to Egypt. They start to prosper there. And then you have the book of Exodus, because you have this period in between Genesis and Exodus where you have 400 and some years of slavery. So then the Exodus narrates that movement of Moses, his journey from Egypt to the wilderness and then back to lead the people out, and the plagues and the establishment of the first Passover and the beginning of these rituals, and the final Exodus that takes them through the Red Sea and destroys the chariots and brings them to the foot of Mount Sinai, where you have the golden calf and the 10 commandments and these new laws, and God's faithful. And then you have a movement from that and that's all in Exodus. And then you have Numbers, which really, again, details who's in that. It details that early settlement, those early laws that they were being developed, that refinement of who they were. That extends into Leviticus, and where you get some of those priestly laws. And then there's the establishment right there of that tabernacle, and then God's presence is dwelling with them, and that establishment of the Levites of that priestly tribe. And so now God was close, and it wasn't no longer up there, but on the ground. But the Levites were that tribe that surrounded them. And again, that picture of that idea of the tribes building around them. So then 2 weeks ago, we looked at Deuteronomy. And that was really this journey, in Leviticus or Numbers was that journey through the desert, the wilderness desert, the 40 years of just wandering. And I don't remember the map where they just went all around and they were just sort of going everywhere. And they were actually kind of on the border of Canaan too, but the promised land, but they didn't have any idea, and God just moving them, but they're following the cloud, and they're going where they're, and so the idea is that they're refining that old generation, they're getting rid of that old generation, and they're establishing that new generation. And then in Deuteronomy, we get that sense of the right before Moses dies. and he's preparing this new generation to enter into the promised land. And what we have in Deuteronomy is that sense of someone is trying to get in here. That sense of they're poised. That Moses gives them the last address, says you can choose obedience as you go into the land and renew this covenant, or you can be disobedient and turmoil will follow. So they know what's going to happen. They've seen it. But this new generation is entering into the land, and as you'll see in Joshua, many of them haven't even been. Hold on one second. Many of them haven't even been circumcised. I'm not sure who iPhone is who just came on. I am muting you though, just because your sound's on. That's okay. But we don't know who you are. You're a mysterious guest. So now Joshua. Moses has just died. Israel's about to enter and cross into the river. And then you have this narrative. But there are a couple of things I want to just point out about Joshua before we get into the narrative itself. One, Joshua really is taking the role of Moses. He's sort of that new Moses figure, but he's different in the sense of he's going to take them to battle. So all this time, the building of the people, the refining of the people, they're about to go to battle. Because when they cross into the Canaanites' territory, they're going to have to pony up and start fighting for this. And this is another way in which God will reveal his power and strength. It is thought that that the book itself is not really like some other books have more cohesive flow to it. This is kind of choppy at some points. And when you get into the chapters 6 through 12, you really have this section that really combines a lot of different little vignettes and stories. And again, that's kind of like the triumphs of Joshua. And so well, as the larger structure would be that Joshua sort of addresses Israel and establishes himself with them. And you see the bit of the narrative. We'll get into a very important passage, and we'll look at this in a minute, of the spies and Rahab and the crossing and actually going into it. And then you have that section between 6 through 12 where you have this list of battles and exploits. And that, again, these are pieces of oral tradition that were passed down through the Israelites. And scholars contend, that this probably happened about the actual events themselves happened probably around the 13th century BC. So 1,300 years before the birth of Christ, just to kind of put that into perspective, 1,300 years. This book was not compiled in Israel's history, or did not surface in its somewhat current formulation. Most scholars agree late 7th century. So again, you got to think that's 500 years of oral tradition. And that's not to say there weren't fragments of things passed down, and stories passed down, but most of civilization prior to the 16th century, or the 14th, or maybe the 15th century, when the Gutenberg press was invented, most of the world was not literate. So even writing them down was more record keeping for the purposes of record keeping, and for the purposes of those who. So you have this priestly order who now would use this stuff. But a lot of those things were passed down. And so, yes, there were written documents, but the current formulation, it came together in a sense, and either that, or the second thought is mid 6th century. And then there are a few, the minority is even as early as the 5th to somewhere in the 5th to 4th century. And what this book, Joshua, along with Judges, the 2 Samuels and Kings, are looked at as Deuteronomists' writings, and they're constructed and they're composed and they're edited together to convey this journey of Israel from the beginning and the establishment of who they were in the promised land. Again, much like the parts past, where either chronicling their victories through God or their failures through their own endeavors. But this is the establishment of not just them occupying the land, which we see in Joshua and having to fight for that, but the establishment of a kingdom in that land, and the Israelite nation as a whole. So you see the building of a temple leading to David, leading to Solomon, And so they became a mighty powerhouse there. But that doesn't mean that sense of dominance at the point in that promised land lasted. And we'll see as we move through the Old Testament, there were highs and lows and good kings and bad kings and battles that they still consisted of. But what we're looking at in Joshua primarily deals with a lot of battles and the establishment of who the Israelites were going to be.
Jason?
Yes.
Who was the writer?
Yes.
wrote this?
And that the Deuteronomists would be the I would say the compilers rather than the author. Joshua was not a scholar; he would not have been writing any of this down. And because it was constructed later, and this is so I think I've shared this with you in the past. I've had a few moments of like challenging crises and sort of shifting in my own thinking during my years in grad school, and the story of the fall of the wall of Jericho was one of those struggles, because I remember reading a commentary that was like, again, it could have been here, it could have been there, and they were kind of just deconstructing the notion of it. And even in preparation for today, if some of you had read about the historical significance of these cities that they mentioned through the book of Joshua, archaeologically, a lot of this is fuzzy, and so, and granted, it goes back a while, however, at this point, we're looking back at quite a few years, 3,000 plus years. So archaeologically, there's a lot of like, where were these cities, where there's evidence of these cities. And I guess in the end, what I've said before is, I don't get lost in the details necessarily, whether I've kind of let go of the fact that they have to be perfect, because they don't. God is perfect. The details don't have to be perfect. It doesn't change the main thrust of what this book is trying to do, which is display God's power and fulfillment of this large covenantal promise that was made to Abraham. So again, Abraham was promised three things in that covenant: a name that would be great, descendants that were numerous as stars in the sky and sands in the sea, and land. A land of their own where they could dwell and establish themselves. And this is that final phase of that. So from all the way from in Genesis, where you have Abraham being promised this threefold covenant, all the way through the rest of those 4.5 books of the Bible, all the way to Joshua, you finally now see the fruition of that final third phase of that covenant in Joshua. So to answer your question, Glenna, there was no single author. It's assumed to be compiled by these Deuteronomists, who also put together Judges, Samuel, and Kings. And again, they were handed down as probably in both, and I'm sure they were written down, and there were fragments along the way. I mean, that's how things get transferred. And again, that's the divine inspiration. That's the trust in God's divine sovereignty, that these things, I mean, and I don't know what point in our culture we started teaching people in the church that it was as if God was like, okay, write it down now, Moses. And Moses was just sitting there in some weird sort of trance and just writing it down as is. That's really not how these books were constructed. Nor do they have to be, and I don't think one gives it more authority than the other either. The important thing, and again, is to have that, and that's what we're looking at, that 50,000 foot view of what actually was happening here. And I think that the hardest thing, and from this point forward, that you're going to have to, I mean, we've wrestled with this question in the past of, we see God who's killing babies and the plague, and flooding the world, and being angry and wanting to smote, and Moses interceding, and God is not this loving, cuddly God that we think of in the past. Now we get into Joshua and we see God's saying, go in my name as you conquer the Canaanites. But there's these harsh imagery of like totally destroyed, annihilation, and destruction, and this is God. This is happening not by the Israelites' power. It's very clear in the book of Joshua that God is the main power behind all military victories. So that's one of the themes we'll look at the end. to say, hey, what does it say about God? How does this sit with our sense of understanding? Because if we're going to take this whole narrative of redemption, we got to take the good and the bad with it. So, okay. That's
Jason,
something. Oh, yeah.
who carried on the oral tradition? Was it the priests, the Levites?
I would imagine the priests would have been those who did that, just because they tended to be probably the sort of generated that sense of holding that together. But like any oral tradition through the history of all of human civilization, you always had elders and storytellers and scribes, in the sense of it was their job. I mean, it was one that was assigned in many cultures to be the person who learned and memorized. And that was this, it wasn't like a game of telephone where, you start with, I like Ken's shirt, and it ends up, Ken likes to ride elephants in December or something. I don't know. That's just what came to mind. Sorry, Ken. But there was that sense of a serious duty. It was something that the oral tradition, and the passing on of those stories. Now, that's not to say that over time those stories haven't morphed and changed, but the idea behind those those tend to be. And honestly, from the inspiration of Scripture side, I do believe that within these oral traditions or fragments or passing on of this material, even though there's 500 plus years apart from the actual events to the actual compiling of the stories into a book, I do believe that God is both present in the actual event and present in the preservation of that, whether it be oral or fragment or whatever it might be, and also in the collection and compilation of that God's Spirit is present there. And so that's the thing. It's not just one act of the Ten Commandments were like, boom, there they are. And I think we kind of assume that about everything else. And I think there's a much more organic and human process in that as well, and God using us. So, all right. Any other thoughts or questions before we dive in?
Well, just Jason,
Yeah.
Speaking, there's not only the stories, but archaeology. Didn't they find like the walls of Jericho and stuff like that?
They did, but they actually dated. They found walls that they assumed could have been that, but archaeology would have suggested, I believe, that it was closer to Bethel than what they thought would have been Jericho. And there's evidence of other cities that have had walls crumble. And the challenge is, 500 years later, even our things that we have 500 years ago now are falling apart. And if it wasn't for modern day preservation techniques, it would be more of an issue. Back then, that stuff would have crumbled.
Yeah.
And I'll say this is the challenge, and I know that, and this is the challenge of having, someone who's a truth teller, and also someone who, like, as I look at these things again, for me, whether it was whether the walls fell at Jericho or whether they fell at Bethel or whether they fell in some unknown city, it really doesn't make a difference. What I confess in this and through this book is that God, what sovereign hand led to led the exploits, but led to the victories. And again, remember that every single time, granted, as much as culture changed much slower back then, and I think we're living in the last century or last 100 years or so that we've lived in one of the most rapidly changing cultural times that we've ever experienced. I mean, before this, it takes forever to things for change. And this is why those of the silent generation and early boomer generation are like, things are changing so fast. Well, yeah, that's exactly right. You're spot on, because you're the last generation to actually experience some stability in culture. But really, since the 50s on, it's just been like change. And now we're to the point where, you have to stay on top of everything or you don't know what's going on. All of a sudden, everyone's playing some silly game called Among Us on on their phones, and they're all like, I don't know what this is going on." But it's a phenomenon that's drawing in 50 billion people across the world. Not that many, but all that's to say is every single time a culture changes and the message that comes through, we have to ask ourselves, what are the Israelites of a current period trying to use these books for? in other words, the role that they play for the Israelites and modern day Jews even is very different for the role they play for us. It's a part of their story. It's a part of their identity. It's part of their cultural heritage that God actually brought. It's a story of how Jews were established in the land that they were. And so that meaning and significance, we talked last week or 2 weeks ago, how many people have gone to, have you guys ever gone to Israel, and the idea of that. I mean, that's a lovely idea for us Americans who are like, yeah, it'd be great to go see where Jesus was. And that's a meaningful thing. But to have that be your cultural and religious heritage, every single generation that followed both the event itself and leading up to the compilation of this book and the development and the construction of this book, they were always teaching these stories with the intent to form their children and their community in an understanding of the events of who they are in relationship to God. And so Jews look at texts very different than we do. In fact, even our sense of holiness of them, like these are, special books and they're sacred. And yes, they're very sacred for them, but for very different reasons. For us, they explained a lot of our sense of understanding of Christ. But for Jews, it's the existence and the establishment of the very identity of who they are in and of themselves. Even as we find here, one of the very first things they did is the new generation was circumcised, which, there's part of you like, well, why weren't they circumcised before that? Maybe they didn't have clean methods in the desert. I don't know, in the wilderness. But one of the first things they did, and again, is the establishment of that identity of who they were. So when they read these, this says God fought for them. Do we read it in the same way? God fought for us. Does that make sense? I don't know what any of your ethnic heritage is, but being half Filipino, I know that as I have grown up and heard stories of Filipino history and the occupation of the Philippines and the challenges of the Philippines, not that actually dramatically affects me because I've been raised kind of in a biracial home in an American context, but I understand the connection of one's cultural identity to the history of your people and to the struggle of your people. So, okay. Any other thoughts or comments on that? Let's delve into the book, and we will. We're going to go through, and I'll point out some themes as we go. If you have your Bible in front of you, we can go. And again, I think it is helpful in these day and age where they have little summaries at the top of each of the sections, so you kind of know what you're looking at. Some of the unique literary features and things that I just want to kind of point out so you see them as we talk about them. One, characters in this book are not plentiful. You have random characters here and there and kings named and that sort of thing, but none of them that really stick or matter a whole lot. But Joshua is one of them. God is the main character in all of these. The whole book of the Bible is, the whole Bible holds the story of God, not the story of humanity. And God's intersection and faithfulness to humanity. That's the overarching. But in this book, you have Joshua, who's kind of like that second Moses. You have Rahab, and I do want to look at that passage as we go in this first section, because this is one of the most phenomenal interlopers in the entire concept of the development of Israel as a people. So you have faith established and credited to this prostitute. Who the spies that will point to escaped through. So she was faithful, and which is, if that wasn't enough, just the faithfulness of a Gentile, and maybe she just was compassionate, maybe it was God, whatever. But she is also one of the few non-Jews who are listed in the beginning of Matthew in Jesus's genealogy. So this story, right in the crux of God establishing the Israelites in the promised land, part of that journey into that process in the beginning was aided and helped by a Gentile. And that does not go unnoticed. And you don't have many places. You have little instances throughout the Old Testament, Jonah and Ninevites. God sending to Jonah to go to the Ninevites. I mean, that's a Gentile reaching out to the Gentiles. But really, this is one of those first places where it's just like significant. Rahab's importance, not only in the establishment of the Israelites, but in that continuity that lead to Christ's line is important. So, two, you have Achan, who's kind of the counter or the one of the sort of protagonists of or antagonist and antagonist of it, who's demonstrating what happens when you disobey and don't follow orders. And then you have the Israelites as a whole. And that's just sort of this new generation of Israelites. Remember, the old generation still on the other side, new generation comes in, and we're going to see what happens to them. The other thing I want to point out is there are a number of miracles. And again, this is God exerting sort of a physical, material force. So you in establishing himself as being God over everything in this land. So you have as the parting of the waters, as the Israelites go into crossing of the Jordan to go into the Jordan parted and the water spread. And so there's this miracle that draws the narrative of this new generation crossing over into the promised land, escaping and moving beyond these 40 years in the desert, and all of this hoopla about that this is the entry, their final triumphant entry. Although nothing's established, they're going in. Echoes back to that splitting of the Red Sea and that redemption that came from Egypt. You have the walls in chapter 6. You have the walls of Jericho coming down, and again, there's 6 days of marching. And then on that 7th day, the trumpets are blown and those walls tumble down. And again, it's God's power over the material world, not just in its natural water sense, but even in human-made structures. God still has control. So an earthquake knocks those down. Chapter 10, you have in a battle, you have hailstones and you have the sun standing still so that they carry on in battle. So again, God intervening and being Lord over all of creation, and these giant miracles are what differentiate the Israelite God from all the other perceived deities in the area. And the last, there's a mentioning of the hardening of hearts. And you have in chapter 11, you have that sense of God actually going beyond the boundaries of the natural world and actually influencing and hardening the hearts of Canaanites. Okay, so let's go through chapter, and we'll break it up this way. The first 5 chapters are sort of Joshua begins to lead in Israel, and then we'll go into the Canaanite battles. But if you look at the beginning of Joshua, you have that Joshua is kind of doing what Moses did. God commissions Joshua in that very beginning part of chapter 1. And again, that's establishing Joshua as the new leader of Israel. You have a very often quoted, be strong and courageous. In that passage there, that sense of Joshua was that brave, militant, strong, courageous, bold leader. And a lot of our character development over the last 50 to 80 years in Christian education has focused on this courage or this strength that Joshua has possessed. Joshua also is preparing the officers and the people for a battle, and that there will be an invasion, and he sends spies to go to Jericho to check out what's going on. And it was at this time that we have this passage of Rahab, who harbors them and then gives them safe passage outside of her, the outside of her window. And again, it's not only that she's a woman, that is the sort of divine reversal of what's happening, this God using the unexpected character, but the fact that she's a woman of disrepute, and chances are, if she has her own spot, she's not just sort of a woman of the street. She's actually using her home, which would not be common for someone who is a prostitute to have so in other words, she might be more of like a, I don't know what the proper term is, like she's running, not that she's running a brothel, but she is more of the person in charge. So there's a sense of she was more established. So she has capacity and she allows them to stay. But the fact that that the spies were saved by a prostitute that was a Gentile. That's, 3 strikes: Gentile, woman, prostitute against her, and that she rises as such a significant figure should not be overlooked. And in fact, I think is one of the most significant parts of the book of Joshua. It's just those early foreshadowing of what is yet to come, largely. But you have this movement through the commissioning, the battle prep, the spies, the significance of Rahab. You have them crossing over into the new land in chapter 3. And then, as you remember, I don't know if those of you read, when they crossed over, they took stone, and the waters spread of the Jordan. They took stones, one for each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they established them in Gilgal. And then in chapter 5, they have the new generation circumcised, which honestly, I forgot about that. And I think that's kind of interesting, just that they weren't. That notion of that circumcision, even after Abraham, how many hundreds of years had passed at this point, that you had a new generation in the wilderness who still had to have that sense of they had to be circumcised. And really, that movement of crossing in the new generation and the establishment of that, that really is what sort of encapsulates this first portion of Joshua. This again, it's establishing them. The battles haven't really began yet. It's just getting them in the land and sort of setting them up. They're setting up shop. They're getting ready for their battles. So, any questions or thoughts about that first section? So then in chapter 5, and this is sort of beginning the battle narrative, chapter 5 and 13, you have a vision that Joshua has, and it's interesting. Once again, Joshua was by Jericho, and he looked up and he saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said, "Are you one of us or one of our adversaries?" And he replied, "Neither, but as a commander of the army of the Lord, I now have come." And this is an important part of the beginning of this battle narrative, because it wasn't just that it was human strength going out and having these battles and beating the Canaanites. Although Joshua was that human commander, there an angel, a battle angel of the Lord came down and was now with them as they were moving into this battle against the Canaanites. 6 through 12, you see these Canaanite battles that begin. You have Jericho in chapter 6, and then you have the sin of Achan of taking and keeping. And he wasn't supposed to keep anything from the conquests. Kind of should shine a little light on the Crusades of the 12th, 13th centuries, everything that happened with that. The raping and pillaging that was going on in the name of Christ. That sin of Achan follows back to that sense of holding on and his death. Joshua renews the covenant in chapter 8. And again, you see that, and I don't know how many times there is this renewal, but with Moses, they kept having to renew. And right before Moses left, he gets them to renew this covenant. And right before Joshua takes them in. So again, that notion of covenantal theology drives the narrative of the Old Testament story. It's about Israel's adherence to the covenant as a whole, or rejection of. You kind of have in this section of 6 to 12, you have kind of two battles. You have one against Jericho, and we know that the walls fell after the 7th. Then they blew the trumpets and they overtook the land or the city. But then you have the city of Ai, and again they defeated that in the end. And then there are these two dominant sort of military conquests of the major cities, and then you have what scholars think that actually were a whole bunch of battles, because really in a matter of about Joshua, in chapter 8, Joshua renews the covenant. And then from 9 till about 12, so in the matter of 3 chapters, you have a lot of little vignettes kind of shoved into these passages. And if they were, as scholars were to date these instances of these, they were spread apart by years. It wasn't like bam, 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 because all of a sudden then you go up to chapter 13, and now all of a sudden Joshua's old. and Joshua is dividing, and it moves to the end of the chapter where Joshua at 23 and 24 is dividing up Israel and gives his final speech. So what you have in a period of like 3 or 4 chapters is a whole bunch of battles. And again, that's that notion of exploits of Joshua that were kind of put in there and allowing them. And again, the theme of that is when they were in obedience and following God, they were having victory. But when you disobey, there's loss. All right, let's stop there. And thoughts or questions up to this point? We're about the midway point of the book.
Jason,
Yeah.
This is Bruce. If this is the 40-year journey, correct, in the desert to get them to the promised land, did they envision, or did anyone envision that it just wasn't going to be given to them, and now they have to have a big fight to actually bring it under their control?
I think that Moses had prepared them for that. There are points where there are battles being talked about, and there's a sense of preparation. And when they were counting the sense of their military forces in Deuteronomy, I think it was what was with the mindset. And honestly, one of the things I was read the idea the Canaanites were kind of considered an evil group of people. Many of the sexual laws that were given to the Israelites were in response to the behaviors of the Canaanites or other foreign tribes. The Canaanites were known for child sacrifice, all sorts of sexual debauchery. And so there was a sense of the story of Joshua in the minds, now us in our current mindset may not see it that way, but in the mindset of the generations that followed, it was God sweeping away the evil of the Canaanites and establishing the righteousness of his people in this land. Okay. So there was almost a righteous anger or a righteous war sense in that larger narrative of who God was. And again, by this point, it wouldn't have been a surprise because it's not as if, like there was battles. God destroyed, how many, between the babies in Egypt and all the military forces that were landed in the Red Sea, God's destroying people left and right. So it didn't shock them. But in our modern mindset, it does. And sometimes it's hard to sort of which is one of my questions at the end. So,
well,
unless you want.
Jason,
yeah.
So Joshua's army were the main aggressors in this thing. And the 40 years, they were the aggressive army pretty much going around.
Yeah, they were kind of the jerks of the crowd. No, I'm Yes, they were aggressive. And again, I didn't go through and read this for the fine-tooth comb. I just sort of skimmed over some stuff, but I don't know if there's any passages that indicate some. I would imagine, just from a human perspective, that if the Israelites in this large, gigantic group of people, again, we're talking at one point, up to 2 million people, and I don't know what they were when they actually entered, but that many people crossing over the Jordan coming into this land, that's a serious threat. And so that idea of if you had, and the Canaanites weren't established, like the Israelites in terms of a people group, that was a much larger people group than probably you had in general that would have bonded together under a single identity. You had lots of Canaanite, smaller Canaanite groups, but the general land was considered Canaan. And if you lived in that land, you were a Canaanite. But tribalism was much stronger. And that's perhaps even as you see as the 12 tribes of Israel and then divided up and given their own lands, even the Israelite division of dividing of the 12 tribes being given land results in challenges and conflict on land and ownership. The idea of owning land in the world is not a new one. And ownership and possession of land, and obviously even however many thousands of years ago, it was tied to a sense of identity.
But I was just thinking about that. If you're looking at it, here you had all these people living in this country, and this huge tribe of Israelites coming in almost like locusts. And you think about that. You look at it from that point of view. A little bit different. Well,
it's very threatening for the Canaanites as well, And honestly, I don't know if they knew it was coming, but it seems to me that if you had a couple million people perhaps outside of on the other side of the Jordan, that you would see them on the other side, and that would be pretty scary.
Yeah.
So I mean, but even then you might say, okay, well, they could have maybe weathered all of the different battles they were going to, but even then the angel of the Lord came down, and so they won these battles pretty swiftly. Not that there weren't losses, but what God didn't want to happen was them to go around battling all these challenges in the land of Canaanite. And again, it wasn't as everyone was like converging in one spot. They had to go to places, they were taking over lands. But that sense of, you don't want like your male population to be completely obliterated through battle and then to leave, so God was with them, and they could have still established themselves with some military reserve as they carried on.
But what about that? I was looking at that section where it talks about they made a peace treaty with the Gibeonites or something.
Yep.
Where is that?
It is in 9, I think.
Chapter 9, right. And did they maintain that so that was one tribe they didn't destroy?
Well, they saved themselves, but they were being a little sneaky and underhanded. I don't know. I didn't read on beyond. I mean, in other words, again, I'm not reading word for word these chapters either. But I don't know. So what happens? I know that as you get later in the book, that they go through this litany of kings that were destroyed. And so what you have in the Canaanite land, again, don't imagine it as like one fortress where all the Canaanites hung out and they had their military forces. They were spread out throughout the land, and each region would have had their own kings and leaders. So it was a matter of a constant, process of conquering over many years. And even then, I think it's interesting that you go into 12, and you have the kings that were conquered by Moses in that sense of, and then the kings that were conquered by Joshua. And so when you go to chapter 12, 9 through 24, you have, I don't know how many. I guess there's at least like 18 kings, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
More than that. 20 kings. So again, those were not, and it starts with, in chapter 9, the king of Jericho. So that was a city. So it was more like the governor of, person ruling of that little. And some of these could be small little hiccup towns that weren't even that big, but they overtook the person established in that land. And that's what really made Israel in part different, is because they were under one leadership. And so they were a force to be reckoned with. And they would have been regardless. The
end of chapter 12 says there were 31 of these kings in all.
There you go. Including Moses. Is it including Moses as ones?
I think
yeah, probably
starts that chapter talking about the ones Moses defeated. So
yeah. And then you see, as you go on through 13 through 22, you see this division. So territory for God, a distribution of the Western territory. So they were settling a massive land, because if it was in fact 2 million people or 1.5 million or whatever it might have been, you can't stick them all right there in the same spot. There was no infrastructure developed for that. So you have pretty much 13 through 22 is Joshua's divvying up of lands and where they would go. And this is, as I was looking the towns of Judah, like, I really care. Like, they list, it's like a whole chapter of a bunch of cities that I can't pronounce. I don't know where they're located. So what difference does it do for me? Well, it doesn't do much for me. But again, these are historic. They're historic books, because they describe the military conquests of early Israel as God was establishing a people. Did they say anything about us or God spiritually or related to our faith? Not really, other than the fact that what we have to reconcile with is, what does it mean to confess a God that led in military victories and battles and the destruction of humanity, of parts of humanity? It wasn't pure genocide, but they were destroying all of the Canaanites. and they couldn't wed with them. They didn't want to be a part of them. Like God was still, God wasn't into the New Testament where he's like, everyone should love one another. It wasn't a love fest yet. This was like, kick them out of the land that I have saved for you. And what did the Canaanites do? They were just people born in that land, doing the best they could. Maybe they were corrupt. Maybe they were bad. I don't know. They were doing some gross things, but was that?
Being, I guess, somewhat of a devil's advocate on that, I compare that with the Native Americans being on this country and the people coming over from Europe invading America. You kind of do a comparison there. And you say, what do you care about those little countries or tribes? But if you'd ask individually what the little tribes thought, you might get a different answer.
Absolutely. And you could say that, Western Europeans came over here with the intent to, that the U.S. was their promised land. I mean, in many ways. And it wasn't, and maybe they were driven by a sense of God ordaining them to be here as well. So, I mean, that's the challenge of, and this is, again, this goes back to, I said it very early on. I think that what we're witnessing and what, if we really take a, 100,000 foot view of the last 2,000 plus years of history, we are evolving as a human race. Not physically necessarily, although you can make an argument. We've adapted and changed. I mean, the fact that we live as long as we do, and we have sustained that, and we've built structures and systems around that. But we have evolved we've evolved in our understanding of ourselves in relationship to God. We've evolved in our understanding in ourselves in relationship to other. The notion, the idea of empathy as being a human characteristic is something that has, in the last 100 years, has made leaps and bounds in our understanding of what it means to empathize with another person, to look at another person with a deep sense of compassion. I guarantee you there were no Israelites going into Canaan thinking, oh, whose family am I destroying? I'm going to kill this man in battle. And there wasn't like, hey, let's kill all the men. It was like, in some sense, it was a slaughtering. But this was part of the process back then. Okay. You go through and then we'll go through here and then 22. So you have all of the territory of this, territory of that. And again, lots of names, lots of things. If you were like me, you probably just your eyes started to glaze over at some point as you go through them. But they're just Joshua dividing everything up. And then you get to the final sort of section when you get to 23. Well, you get the end of 22, you have memorial altars set up, and then you have Joshua extorts the people. And it basically kind of does the exact same thing that Moses did before he dies. And he's like saying again, reiterating the point, if you are obedient to God's statutes, if you remain faithful to the covenant, God will be faithful to you and you will thrive as a people. If you're disobedient, if you're rebellious, if you continue, and that's again why they told the stories of the whole story of the Exodus and all of that stuff was to remind this new generation of the consequences of disobedience and unfaithfulness to the covenant of God. So Joshua challenges them and offers them a choice to live, and then in the last chapter he dies and is buried, and Ebenezer is put on top of. So that's kind of the story of Joshua. Again, you see those main central characters come out of Joshua and his military exploits, Rahab and the redemption, the sin of Achan, the Israelites really having victory, but still in the midst of that, you see points where you see a little bit of that creeping in of rebellion. And then ultimately, you see the faithfulness of God, both over creation, both over military exploits, both over the human heart. You see this divine sort of establishment. And really the overarching idea behind Joshua is God is fulfilling the covenant that he promised Abraham.
Jason, I thought one interesting point was the fact that the Levites did not get any land. The Levites said were not given land, but they were allowed to live in cities and they were allowed pasture land for their cattle. And is that because that they needed to be distributed throughout the country? They were the priest, So they needed to be distributed throughout the country. And so that he didn't want them in one spot, all in one spot.
And because, I mean, it's a large swath of land. You got to kind of think northern Israel to southern Israel, and these giant, I mean, it was a huge, huge land. I mean, everything kind of east of the Sea of Galilee, and then farther down to the Dead Sea over from those west to the Mediterranean coast. So I don't know if you looked up, and I should have brought one, but a map of some of that division. They were spreading them out. So yeah, you no longer could have one, and remember that picture that was kind of the Levites, the tabernacle and the Levite tribes surrounded them, and then the other tribes surrounded them in concentric circles. The idea was now that there would still be a central place for the temple, but that the Levites were spread throughout, so that they established themselves in each of the different land and each of the different tribes. Similar to what we do now.
One thing I can't understand is, can you hear me, Jason?
I can, yeah.
When it talked about they were going to get the land to the Euphrates River, and it doesn't look like any of this goes to the Euphrates River.
I'm not even sure where the Euphrates. Let me just do it.
The Euphrates goes through Iraq, doesn't it?
Which verse are you talking about in particular? Let me just see.
Well, I don't know. It just seems like they never really got all the land he promised to Abraham and through Moses.
Oh, maybe. I mean, and and the question becomes, what are the boundaries of the promised land? Yeah, the Euphrates goes a little farther than I would expect. Which verse is that?
Oh, I don't remember. I just remember reading in Deuteronomy, it was said that they were going to get the land to the Euphrates River. And I thought, I don't know where it is, but I thought it was in Iraq. It didn't seem like they went far enough east
To hit the Euphrates. No, they did. And honestly, I don't know to the extent of how far that land goes out there. And maybe that there is some sense in a broader, that land also, that whole region, and again, shifting lands and times, was considered part of that Fertile Crescent where sort of civilization started. And the reason I think that for many theologians that the land of Israel, it's presumed that somewhere in that region was that original Garden of Eden, and that was sort of the land that God had sanctified. So, and then they had to make their way back there. But it's that notion of Pangea, where the geography that we have now may not be the exact same geography they had 3,000 years ago. You know what I'm talking about? How the land masses all fit together, and I don't know where they separated when that happened, but if you ever looked at that Pangea map, it kind of like, if you take North America and South America and Central America, and you take, this is my direction, maybe not, and you smush them together, you kind of get one giant landmass. And so that idea that even in that spreading of that, so you could still have shifting. I mean, 3,000 years later, you could have shifting of rivers and things that look differently now than they did. I mean, even here in Lake City, 150 years ago, we've shifted a river. Apparently, I'm right now in a riverbed. So if humans can shift a river in the mountains, certainly over a period of 3,000 years, there may be some shifts that change the direction and nature of that river or where it came into it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't know. It just seemed like they never really got all the land that God promised to Abraham.
No, and that's why this whole notion of territory and land and temple and Jerusalem and in terms of the Israelites and the Palestinians and even the Christians have their hand in that. Who does Jerusalem belong to? For the Israelites, that's their birthright. That's where they were established. So in America, as I think, generally traditionally sided with the Israelites, but that battle of that land is not something. It's not just about territory of modern day military operations. It's something that's much more cultural and steeped in the history of their identity.
Jason, you were talking earlier about the Gibeonites and how they fooled Joshua.
Yeah,
And
9, right?
the last of chapter 9, it says, so Joshua did not allow the people of Israel to kill them, but from that day forward, he made the Gibeonites the woodcutters and the water carriers for the community of Israel and
Slavery.
for the altar of the Lord. So he didn't let them get by with it totally. He was, he punished them by making the woodcutters. It was 26, verse 26, chapter 9.
And you see that, and again, you see that again in when the Israelites have exile. When you have the story of Ruth and Naomi and Esther, you have this sense of people somewhat living together, not quite slavery, but more in probably indentured servitude style, I guess would be the most modern day equivalent we would have to understand that. So that means that they still dwelt among them as workers. And at some point, again, you would have intermixing, but honestly, the whole region, that's the interesting thing is that, when we think of different cultures and races, we think of very distinct physical, ethnographic features of who we are. A Filipino looks different from a white American, different from an African or a South American or wherever you might be. We all bring these very different physical characteristics, but you got to remember that the Israelites back then, there wasn't much differentiating them from one another. They all were slightly brown people, like Filipinos. Just to not to destroy just to remind you, there were no white people in the Bible. I'm kidding.
No. Contrary to popular opinion.
Contrary to popular opinion, there were no white people in Scripture.
Jesus did have blonde hair and blue eyes.
Did not have blonde hair and
Blue
eyes.
eyes.
unless he had like an abnormality, but I don't think anyone wants to develop a doctrine around that. So what else? Do you see the connection? The thing that's important for me in this whole journey is that, and we'll keep, and at some point you're going to be like, do we have to go back through the story again? And the answer will be yes, because when you're sick of hearing it, it means that you're internalizing it. Because what we want a year from now, or a little less than a year from now, is after this whole journey through the Scripture to have that grand sense of, oh, and Joshua, this was the beginning of the new, you don't remember anything more about Joshua than it was the beginning of the establishment of the Israelites in the Promised Land. That Rahab was an important figure in terms of that process, and that God was with the Israelites as they conquered the land until Joshua's death. And other than that, you can look up any important details or anything that you really want to get into. But really, if you have that broader understanding, again, that movement and God's faithfulness to the Israelites through that process. That's what we're focusing on. Any other thoughts?
I thought it was interesting that Achan, or however you pronounce his name, that buried the gold and the possessions. His sin not only affected him, but it affected all of those soldiers that were killed as they retreated. It affected the army to be defeated for the first time before they went ahead and defeated them. So sin has consequences not only for us, but for, in many cases, others that are around us.
Yeah, and in many cases, I mean, I think that you see that again reiterated in the fact that the older generation of the Israelites, their sins prohibited them from coming into the Promised Land. Mm. And they had to wander in a desert for 40 years, for crying out loud.
Is the end of the book kind of like establishing another covenant? Or is it?
It's reiteration.
What's that?
It's a reiteration. It's a reestablishment. So here's the thing is that you really have, there's in covenantal theology, there's debate whether the Mosaic covenant with Israel, it really counts as one of those covenants. Some people will not list it. They'll go Adam, the Adamic covenant, the Noahic covenant, the Abrahamic covenant, and then they jump to the Davidic covenant. And then the last one will be the new covenant in Jeremiah. And some covenantal theorists will stick Moses in there, and some people will say that it's just the refining of the covenant that God made with Abraham. So you have, and I mean, I'm fine with it being in there as a Mosaic covenant because I think it's worth noting because it's the establishment of law with God and the Israelites. But I would say but everything that precedes that covenant from the establishment and the outplaying of that, with Abraham and Noah and Adam, it was kind of like, here's your covenant, just go and do it. Whereas the covenant that was established and built with Moses had a lot more intricate, it was a lot more intricate and it was a lot more, detailed. And so that was an unfolding process that led, because they were growing as a people. When it's just a few of you, it's pretty easy to organize it. Once you got 2 million people, you gotta be a little more organized. All right, anything else?
It's just that, like, verse 35 or whatever,
Of what
Joshua,
chapter?
at the last chapter, chapter 24. Joshua helped Israel make an agreement with the Lord that day at Shechem. Joshua made laws for Israel and wrote them down in the book. This almost sounds like a formal covenant there.
I think it was a reestablishment. Where are you at, Glenda?
Verse 35
Of
chapter 24, almost to the end there.
That's interesting.
I can't read these numbers, I'm sorry.
Is it 33? Because mine ends at 33.
Yeah, 25.
Did you write your own verses?
My numbers are small, 25.
Did you add some new verses?
Yeah.
So God made, gotcha. So 25. I see. Okay. So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day and made statutes and ordinances for them. He took 2 large stones and set them up under the oak of the sanctuary of the Lord. See, these stones shall be a witness against us. That was a visual sign. I mean, again, remember the passage where God had to give Moses the second commandments, where he was like, remember those commandments that you broke, that you threw over, the ones that I had to, and God was like really digging into Moses, like the ones you dropped, the commandments that you dropped that I now have to make again. I give them to you, the ones that you dropped. And so but those were then carried in the Ark of the Covenant. They would have been in the Holy of Holies. So this is more of a visual, a reiteration of those laws and a reminder of those laws in a public sense, because they wouldn't have had access to the tablets themselves. Even the priest in that regard of the Holy of Holies, I don't believe would have had access to them. They remained in the Ark until Indiana Jones let them loose.
Yeah.
All right, final thoughts? We're a little early. So then I guess the question I want to end on, and how are you feeling about God in these first 6 books of the Bible?
He's holy.
He's holy.
He's a big guy up there. I don't get the kind of strong connection that a lot of us are privileged to feel with him. I get he's just sort of a big guy.
Well,
Separated in many ways from most of the people.
That's that holiness.
well, if he created all of mankind, now he's chosen sides. I mean, that's the way it seems to me. I mean, holy cow.
Holy moly.
It looks like to me that, he has chosen righteousness, and if we're not good, we're going to get zapped in the Old Testament.
And the interesting thing about that, Ken, is that I don't know if he's chosen a people to be righteous, because if there's anything that you can't escape in these first 6 books, is that the Israelites just kept messing up.
Mhm.
Yeah.
They're just, and so God chooses to establish righteousness through a people in spite of them.
He appears, he's an aggressive, very aggressive, demanding God who you better do what he wants or you're going to be in trouble.
You can't just say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I did that," and he says, "I forgive you." Like nowadays, whatever you do wrong, you just say you're sorry and it's okay because he loves you. Well, I don't think it was like that back then.
No,
I agree.
They were getting stoned.
Not for
we're pretty lucky in that regard.
Yeah.
We absolutely are.
not for individual people, but overall, he kept coming back. He kept giving the people of Israel a chance after chance to repent, and then, I mean, some people would have to die. Some people wouldn't survive it because they had disobeyed. But the people overall, I mean, he promised he wouldn't destroy the whole world again. So he kept on giving them another chance and another chance. So, yeah, individual people, it seems kind of cruel at times, but
Well,
he keeps giving chances.
how did we ever, and did I miss, how did God decide on the Israelites as opposed to the Africans or the Filipinos? How did he pick the Israelites?
We don't. I mean, really, there. And again, before that, I don't think there wasn't a sense of people groups in the same way. It was really the decision to establish a covenant with Abraham, and so Abraham became the father of the Israelites. But it wasn't as if they were established as the Israelites back then. And then God was like, I want to choose those people. It was really a covenant. In the same way God made a covenant with Adam and Eve, God made a covenant with Noah, and God made a covenant with Abraham and Sarah.
But has it ever been mentioned why, as an example, why didn't he pick the Asians?
Oh, he did. You just don't realize it. I don't. Why? Because and that goes back to the notion of the Fertile Crescent, and in that region, it's the idea of where all civilization started. In that, and this goes back to, and I said this way back when, the earliest form of deities or a religious cosmology was polytheism. And as they moved east, it moved east in the form of what we now know as Hinduism. So Hinduism is filled with lots of gods, and they all have different functions. Well, as it spread west, it went in the form of Greek mythology. And so the region of the Mediterranean was dominated by this notion of polytheism, which is what made Israel's radical monotheism, saying there is only one real God, so different from everywhere else in the land. We think of one God in three persons because we have a hybrid version of it, but that sense of monotheism, that there would only be one God, was not something that the rest of the understanding of civilization did not have an understanding of monotheism. It was driven by polytheism out of that same region. It's where the land was established. And maybe where the Garden of Eden was, I don't know. All right, anything else? Final thoughts? Next week, we will delve into Samuel, or Judges. Next week, we'll get into the Judges. Now we're going to get a little judgy. Judges is kind of a fun book. It kind of, and as we move through Judges and Samuel, you can start to get into, this will be the period from Joshua to connecting it all the way through Jesse and David. And so when we talk about the Jesse tree, Rahab's line leads to Jesse. So obviously, it wasn't just Rahab was involved in this more than just letting them down the rope at the back of the window. There was a little bit more intimate contact involved because she has her bloodline in Christ's bloodline. So went from that to her bloodline led to Jesse. And then this is how we get the notion of the Jesse tree, of that sort of pinnacle place of where God established a kingdom on earth through King David. But again, not through just establishing and done. The people were like, no, we want Saul, and we'll look at that again. And David was established, and then God finally made that push over, regardless of how you act, no matter what you do with David, and your people, I'll still love you. And that unconditional love, and that set the stage then again for Jeremiah's prophecy of what we're celebrating now, Christ's incarnation. So these are significant passages in terms of the fulfillment of the covenant. And this week on Sunday, as we look at the narrative in Mark of John the Baptist, even that harrows back to that sense of this covenant that was established with Israel.
What about the book of Ruth? You're saying we're going from Judges to Samuel, but there's the book of Ruth.
Did we skip Judge? Oh, maybe I skipped that. No, Ruth is in there, Chad. I just wrote down, I couldn't remember what came after that.
And that's also in the line of Christ.
It is. It's the line. Yeah, absolutely. And it's in the line of again, of God incorporating others into, and this is the hard part. There probably was a lot of Canaanite and regional territory intermixing with Israel, whether we want to, and so in some sense, and ethnically, they were all kind of a similar swath, so it was much less shocking. But this is what made circumcision so different for the Israelites, is because no one would actually do that to themselves just for the heck of it. So the Israelites were obeying something that distinguished them. All right. And again, always available, my book on circumcision.
Oh my.
And on that note, we will, and I want to encourage you, even if you haven't downloaded those Jesse Tree things, really, it's a very, it doesn't take more than 5 minutes over a cup of coffee, and you don't even have to color them, but just having those symbols cut off in some place where that intersect with your life over the next 20 some days will, I guarantee you, if you have them in a place where you've been reading those passages and you see those symbols, it will shape your Advent season, because every single time you see them, that ladder reminds me of Jacob, and that understanding of that narrative that we've just gone through over the past 6 or 7 weeks will be reiterated for you, and those are the things that we need to know. When we look at how critical the story is of Israel's exodus and the establishment of God and the establishment of Israel as God's people, that's an important part of Israel's narrative and identity, and it ought to be an important part of ours. So anyway, it's 6:35. We're going to go, and peace be with you, and we'll see you on Sunday.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
You.